In the maternity ward of St. Mary's General Hospital, the gentle spring sunlight streaming through the windows softly illuminated the pristine white walls of the nursery. Carol Anderson gazed at her sleeping child through the glass, wishing this moment could last forever. "The baby is doing wonderfully," came the nurse's cheerful voice, bringing Carol back to reality. Her first childbirth at 40. Despite being considered high risk, she had managed to deliver safely. As she contemplated balancing her research career at a biotech firm with her new family life, she felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Carol, who held a PhD in biology from the University of Chicago and worked as a senior researcher at a Boston biotech company, had lived solely for her career until that investment seminar 3 years ago. It was at the reception following her lecture on pharmaceutical development that she met Thomas Anderson, an investment bank analyst. "Mrs. Anderson," called a voice. It was Dr. Stephen Murphy, the head of obstetrics. "Everything is ready for discharge. You can go home with your baby tomorrow morning." Carol smiled and nodded, but there was a hint of tension in her expression. It wasn't just the anxiety of being a new mother. The presence of her mother-in-law, Barbara Anderson, weighed heavily on her mind. Barbara, despite being a board member of St. Mary's General Hospital, hadn't visited the room once in these 3 days. Instead, she had been sending various advice through hospital staff about the importance of breastfeeding, traditional postpartum care, and most notably, educational policies for the Anderson family heir. Thomas, a Princeton graduate working at State Street Corporation, had been apologetically watching his mother's excessive interference. Since losing his first wife Jane in an accident, he had become more susceptible to his mother's influence. Meeting Carol had been a turning point in his life. The couple had met at a medical investment seminar and carefully nurtured their relationship. It took them a year to decide on marriage. Throughout this time, Barbara's reluctant attitude had remained consistent. To Barbara, who came from a proud upper-class traditional family, Carol, from Chicago's middle class, might not have been deemed suitable as a partner for her son. "Mother still hasn't." Carol began to ask when Thomas visited at dusk, but swallowed her words. Her husband, though showing signs of fatigue from his work as an investment bank analyst, offered a gentle smile. "She said she's busy with work. It's the fiscal closing period for the board." They both knew this was just an excuse. Barbara's true feelings had been revealed when they set up their new home in Boston's upscale suburbs. "It's too close to where Jane's memories are." Since then, Thomas had carefully tried to avoid being caught between his mother and wife. Jane had been perfect. Coming from a Boston Brahmin family and raised in the same social circles as Barbara, she had been an impeccable wife for the Anderson family's heir. After losing her suddenly in an accident, Barbara's attachment to her son had intensified. Having lost her husband 10 years earlier, perhaps her son was her only emotional support. "Tomorrow marks the beginning of a new life," Thomas said, taking Carol's hand. Carol in her J.Crew dress was a stark contrast to Jane, who had favored Chanel. However, her intellectual and warm personality had steadily healed Thomas's heart. Outside the window, the spring evening was deepening. Tulips bloomed vibrantly across Boston's cityscape. The setting sun cast a warm light through the hospital room, as if blessing their future. Yet, no one could notice the unknown shadow that was creeping into that light. Carol looked at her baby again through the nursery window. A tiny life. The beginning of a new family. While it represented certain hope, for someone else, it was an unbearable reality. In the quiet residential area of Newton, young maple leaves swayed in the wind. Among the rows of elegant colonial-style houses, the Andersons' new white residence warmly reflected the spring sunlight. Finally home. Carol sighed with relief as she gazed at her baby in the passenger seat. She thanked Jennifer, the nurse who had driven them, and carefully stepped out of the car. Thanks to the hospital's transportation service, they had managed to discharge without interrupting her husband's work. That's when it happened. Mrs. Carol Anderson. At the sudden voice of a man appearing before her, Carol instinctively held her baby tighter. I'm Mike Donovan from the Metropolitan Police Special Investigation Unit. We need to talk about that baby. What? What do you mean? Her voice trembled. Nurse Jennifer watched the situation with a confused expression. The spring breeze began to shake the maple leaves more violently. We received a report that this baby was kidnapped. Please check this birth certificate. The moment Carol looked at the document the detective held out, her legs began to shake. Her name was indeed there. But the date was wrong. It showed a date from 20 years ago. This is a mistake. This child is. I gave birth to this baby 3 days ago. Her desperate voice echoed through the quiet residential street. Curious eyes began peering from neighboring windows. Jennifer nervously pulled out her mobile phone. There is no record of your delivery in the hospital system. Instead, there's a record of a stillbirth from 20 years ago. That's not true. Ask Dr. Murphy. The nurses too. At that moment, Carol began to recall something unsettling. During her hospital stay, something had felt off. The subtle attitudes of the staff, the unnatural delay in discharge procedures, and please let me call Thomas. My husband. As Carol reached for her phone with trembling hands, a female detective approached. I'm sorry, but under these circumstances, we'll need to take temporary custody of the baby. No. This child is mine. Please, just listen a little longer. With an anguished cry, Carol held her baby tightly. However, trained police officers gently but firmly separated the small life from its mother. This can't be. Carol's vision began to blur. What was happening before her eyes felt surreal, like a nightmare. But the cold sensation of handcuffs on her wrists confirmed this was undeniable reality. At that moment, she noticed a familiar luxury car stopping beyond the police car. Mother-in-law. Barbara Anderson stepped out of the car. With her usual elegant bearing, but wearing a somewhat different expression. She held some documents in her hand. Why? The question was drowned out by the sound of the police car door closing. No sirens were activated, as if being considerate not to disturb the peace of this upscale neighborhood. The scenery outside the car window began to move slowly. The tulips, young maple leaves, and Barbara standing at the entrance gradually receded into the distance. In the police car heading to the station, Carol desperately tried to recall the events from 3 days ago. The smooth delivery. The kind hospital staff. The first meeting with her baby. And the slightly off sense of time. Everything had been too perfect. As if it had been meticulously planned by someone. Let me know if you feel unwell, came the gentle voice of the female detective from the front seat. Her name tag, Rachel Green, gleamed in the spring sunlight. Carol rested her forehead against the cold window, its sensation making this situation feel even more real. Then her phone began to ring. It was from Thomas. But she was no longer allowed to answer it. The ringtone merely continued to echo emptily in the car. I recommend St. Mary's General Hospital. It had been 2 months after confirming her pregnancy. In the living room of their upscale suburban Boston home, Barbara had announced this with a perfect smile. In the space surrounded by European antique furniture, those words had resonated without any sense of dissonance. But Mom, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center might be. Thomas, you understand, don't you? Barbara's voice was soft but firm. Dressed in a gray Chanel suit, she blended perfectly into this luxurious reception room, like one of its furnishings. I'm a board member there. I can arrange the best medical team. Besides. A moment of hesitation. It seemed so calculated, it could only be an act. Jane also. The air froze. Carol unconsciously gripped the hem of her and Taylor dress tightly. Whenever the first wife's name came up in conversation, time seemed to stop in this house. I understand. At Carol's words, Barbara nodded with satisfaction. It looked like a smile of victory. From the next day, preparations for the delivery began. Barbara's influence extended to every corner of the hospital. The consultation with Dr. Murphy, the head of obstetrics, the selection of the midwife team, the arrangement of a private room. Everything proceeded perfectly, and somewhat unnaturally smoothly. Carol, are you all right? One day after a checkup, Thomas asked worriedly. He had come to the hospital between important meetings at State Street Corporation. Yes, I'm fine. It's just. Carol continued, carefully choosing her words. The nurses seem a bit strange. It's like they're being overly cautious with me. It wasn't just her imagination. There was a clear sense of unease in the hospital staff's behavior. Excessively polite, yet seeming to hide their true feelings. This was especially noticeable when Barbara was at the hospital. Isn't it because you're the board member's daughter-in-law? Thomas said with a gentle smile. But Carol couldn't help feeling there was something more to it. Through daily checkups, Carol gradually learned about the hospital's internal affairs. Barbara's influence wasn't merely superficial. Over 20 years of experience as a board member. Connections through charitable work. And ties with Jane's family lineage. These were intricately intertwined, casting a web-like influence over the entire hospital. Ma'am, did you know about the transition to the new system? One day, an elderly nurse approached her, speaking as if making casual conversation. System? Yes, the hospital's record system. We're switching from the old one to the new. The conversation was interrupted, but it continued to nag at Carol's mind. Later, she would realize its significance. As she entered late pregnancy, Barbara's interference grew stronger. This is the Anderson family heir. Education is most important. I think Jane should have done this. I want you to understand our traditions. Behind these words, Jane's shadow was always lurking. Mom thought of Jane like a daughter, Thomas said one night, unusually speaking about the past. Meeting at the tennis club, their romantic newlywed life on Nantucket Island. And then, that sudden accident. They both grew up in the same social circles. The rest of his words sank into his glass of whiskey. As the due date approached, subtle changes began appearing in the hospital atmosphere. Particularly noticeable was the rotation of night shift staff. Unfamiliar faces increased, each seeming to harbor some secret. We're increasing personnel at night for data migration work, Kate Wilson, a young system administration staff member, explained, her expression showing slight conflict. A week before the due date, Carol caught her first glimpse of Barbara's true nature. In the hospital boardroom. An unexpected visit, accidentally overheard conversation. She's not suitable for our lineage. An ice-cold voice. There was a dangerous resonance beneath the usual elegant mask. But, Chairwoman. With records from 20 years ago, no one will notice. At the time, she couldn't understand the meaning of that conversation. But now, in the police car, all the pieces were beginning to connect. The seemingly perfect preparations. The unnaturally kind treatment. And Barbara's abnormal obsession. Her phone rang again. This time from her colleague at the Boston biotech firm. Probably about a research data deadline. But now, that was the least of her concerns. Outside the window, Boston's cityscape rolled by. The shadows of skyscrapers crossed the police car windows like black bands. The spring sunlight shone brilliantly, as if mocking this situation. Boston Police Department Special Investigation Unit. In the dim office, the bluish light of monitors flickered. Green, are you sure about this lead? Unit Chief James Murphy eyed rookie detective Rachel Green skeptically. Her desk was piled with massive amounts of documentation. Yes. There are clear inconsistencies in St. Mary's General Hospital's record system. Her voice carried conviction unusual for a rookie. At 29, despite excellent grades at the FBI Academy, she had deliberately chosen the Boston Police Department, and she possessed intuition second to none. This is a report from the board chairwoman. Barbara Anderson. You understand the weight of that name? The chief's voice carried a warning. But Rachel didn't give up. That's precisely why, sir. She turned the monitor toward the chief. The screen displayed records from both the hospital's old database and new system side by side. The stillbirth record from 20 years ago. There were already unnatural points when it was digitized from paper records. The mouse cursor highlighted various anomalies in the data. Inconsistencies in recording times. Subtle discrepancies in doctors' signatures. And most importantly, this font is different from what was used at the time. Rachel recalled the document analysis techniques she learned during FBI training. Attention to detail sometimes reveals greater truths. Also, the surveillance footage. She opened another window. The screen showed people moving through hospital corridors. The date was 3 days ago, Carol Anderson's scheduled delivery date. Look at this nurse. The footage captured a nurse passing in front of the nursery. The uniform is the same. But the way they walk is different. There's a subtle unnaturalness you wouldn't see in professional nurses. Is that all? The chief's voice remained skeptical. No. Rachel produced records from a confidential interview with Kate Wilson, a young staff member from the hospital's system administration. She testified that she received special instructions from Chairwoman Barbara. Special instructions? Yes. To modify old data under the cover of the system migration. Kate's testimony was like piercing through an ice wall. Rachel dug deeper. Hospital personnel records. Board meeting minutes. And newspaper articles from 20 years ago. They all formed strange patterns around Barbara Anderson. I also investigated the first wife, Jane. Rachel spread out old society page clippings. They showed a photo of young Jane and Barbara smiling at a charity event. Their relationship was more than just mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Boston's upper society. The pride of generations old and noble families. And the twisted obsession lurking in their shadows. All of these formed the background of this case. And this too. She displayed different footage captured by the hospital's security cameras. The night before the scheduled delivery. Barbara entering the hospital's record storage room. And hours later, another person leaving the same room. During these hours, no regular staff. Wait. The chief showed a serious expression for the first time. So Carol Anderson's delivery. Yes. It actually took place. But the records were deliberately altered. Replaced with stillbirth records from 20 years ago. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Rachel picked up a photo from her desk. It showed Carol holding her newborn baby, her expression filled with maternal joy deeper than any happiness in this world. This isn't just a kidnapping case. Rachel stood up. The spring evening light was streaming through the window. This is a twisted form of love from a woman trying to protect her perfect family. At that moment, hurried footsteps were heard from the hallway. The door opened, and a young officer burst in. Detective Green. We've received information that Barbara Anderson is heading to the hospital. Rachel immediately grabbed her coat. Let's go. Behind her, she heard the chief heave a heavy sigh. But now, there was no time to worry about that. The truth was finally about to emerge. When they rushed out of police headquarters, night was beginning to fall over Boston. The police siren cut through the quiet residential air. In the boardroom of St. Mary's General Hospital, Barbara Anderson stood alone against the night view. In her hand, she held an old photograph. A single shot capturing young Jane and herself smiling on a Nantucket beach. A perfect moment from the past, sealed in time. Don't move further inside. Rachel Green's voice echoed behind her. Barbara turned slowly. Her expression no longer wore a mask. You wouldn't understand, Barbara's voice was quiet. What it means to protect a perfect family. A perfect family. Rachel stepped forward. You fabricated Carol's delivery and tried to take her baby. Is that your idea of a perfect family? Jane was perfect. Tears glistened in Barbara's eyes. She understood the pride of the Anderson family, having grown up in my world. Her breeding, her education, everything was impeccable. But that accident. She gazed out the window. Boston's night view sparkled like past glory. Then came Carol. Middle class from Chicago. She couldn't possibly understand Boston's traditions. Thomas deserved someone more. So the baby. The records from 20 years ago were perfect. Barbara smiled sadly. My hospital. Trustworthy staff. And the perfect opportunity of a system migration. Everything should have been a perfect plan. At that moment, footsteps were heard from the hallway. Mother. Thomas burst into the room with Carol. Why would you do this? His voice was filled with deep sadness rather than anger. For your happiness. Happiness? Thomas's voice trembled. Don't you understand what makes me happy? When I met Carol, for the first time His words caught in his throat. But as if waiting for this moment, Carol stepped forward. "Barbara," her voice was surprisingly gentle. "I understand a little of how you feel. A mother's desire for her son's happiness. The inability to let go of a perfect past." Surprise flickered in Barbara's eyes. "But new life is born to create the future, not to bind the past." Carol took out a photo of the baby. "This child will create new history for the Anderson family. I want you to be part of that history too." Silence fell. At that moment, fireworks lit up the night sky. Light from Boston Bay gently illuminated the boardroom. The old photograph slipped from Barbara's hands. In that instant, all masks fell from her face. What remained was just the figure of a sad mother. Thomas rushed to embrace his mother. "Mom, that's enough. Let's cherish the memories with Jane as memories. But we have a new family now." Rachel quietly began to leave, but Carol stopped her. "Thank you for revealing the truth." Later, Barbara received a suspended sentence with probation. She resigned from the hospital board and was effectively forced to retire from social circles. However, 6 months later, a new family photo adorned the Anderson family living room. Carol and Thomas holding their baby in the center, and beside them, Barbara showing a genuine smile for the first time. Outside the window, Boston's autumn sunlight streamed in warmly, bathing the room in a golden glow that seemed to promise a brighter future for them all.